Hi, this is Girls Who Gab with Habs and Muffy. In this episode, we are going to talk about the news. It reminds me of the saying, what's in a name? What's in the news? Where do we get our news and why? For the content, entertainment, or none of the above? In this episode, we will chat about what the news has meant to us throughout our lives and our memories, and oh so much more. So listen up.
Wow, the topic of the news. I was thinking about this. I was thinking about, the history of the news for me. And what I mean by that is, where did I start with the news and where am I currently with the news? I don't think growing up I really cared very much for the news. I know my parents would watch the local news and this and that, and I never really paid attention, and we didn't have the same kind of access to the news because we didn't have cable TV. But I started paying more and more attention, I think, as I went to college. I was a political science major, so you'd think I would have, looked at it a lot sooner. But no, I really did not, other than, what I got through my parents. I have to say, one of my first, major experiences with the news was when I took an internship in D.C. after college with the Edelman PR agency, public relations agency. And so I was an intern. It was 6 months. I can't remember if I got paid or not. But essentially our jobs were to go through tons and tons of newspapers every day for news articles and things about our clients or potential clients. So I got introduced to every newspaper in the world. One of my favorite newspapers, ironically, I know my husband would laugh at this, was the Financial Times. I think it's either pink or orange, but it's a different color. But I actually really like the Financial Times for the articles and everything. I would say I'm a decent reader. I mean, I used to read a ton. I don't as much now because kids, really. I mean, that's where it kind of stopped a little bit. But when A and I were first married, I got the Wall Street Journal. Loved the Wall Street Journal. Loved the idea of getting it. Loved the idea of flipping through it. I mean, he and I would drive to Maine, just for the weekend, mind you. We'd leave on a Friday night and we'd come home on a Sunday night. And one of my favorite things was reading the Wall Street Journal to him on the way up. I would read various articles. I mean, I wouldn't read the whole paper, but, and we'd talk about, different things and different subjects, but I love the Wall Street Journal. I gave it up when I had kids. I just, there's no time, right? Maybe as adults, you don't get into the news until you're older. Maybe it's, I don't want to say an old person thing, but a little bit. But yeah, I didn't really get into the news until that point. And then I would say when we moved out, well, even before that, I mean, with the Sirius and XM radio, I had a lot more access to all different kinds of news, BBC, all this just different types of news. So I actually really enjoyed that. But yeah, once we had tea, I just really couldn't stay up on top of I'm just getting back into reading now, and that's almost 17 years later, which is crazy. But I mean, I would watch television, but from a reading standpoint, I really like reading the news. It's so different than watching, right? Obviously. I think I've gone through an influx of news, and what it means to me and the type of news has changed over time. I would say nowadays I'm less about the Wall Street Journal or kind of those deeper thinking pieces, just because it's so heavy and it's so, I don't have room for it in my life. So as you know, because I talk about it incessantly, is I watched the Today Show. I know everybody has their different morning show, or not everybody, but I'm generalizing a little bit. But some people like CBS, some people like Fox, some people like ABC, but I love the Today Show. And the number one reason I like it, and for better, for worse, is just, yes, there's hard news, but there's just a lot of human interest stories. There's a lot of fun in it, and it just, it fills that void of, like, fun for me. And like I said, maybe better for worse, but a lot, I do have fun in other parts of my life, don't get me wrong, but it's just, it provides fun news. And because all the other stuff in the world and, what we have going on is just crazy, and one can totally be, kind of led down a slippery slope. And for me, I always have people saying, oh, but that's not really the news. Exactly. That's why I watch it. I'm not putting down the newscasters. I think they're excellent, amazing. And they do tell the news, but they also provide a lot of human interest stories, and they have fun. Because they're people like us. They're people like, not exactly, but you know what I mean. It's just, kudos to them for just, I feel, and maybe I'm wrong, but they're having a really good time at their job. And isn't that what everybody wants? They want to have fun and make money, and they're making money, right? So, I don't know. I would have to say that I've always really enjoyed the BBC. I've always, in my later years, we go up to Maine, and my in-laws, in particular my father-in-law, loves to watch the PBS hour, the news hour on Friday, maybe sometimes Saturday. But I actually really like that because it's, there's a lot of thought pieces, and so they take a topic and then they really analyze it from a couple of different perspectives. So that's another one that I like, and I would say most of my girlfriends, can't talk, like CBS Sunday morning, right? Because again, it's that human interest, it's factual, it kind of it shares a story, and it engages the audience member. So there's all these different components of the news and how they resonate with you at certain times in your life, and how you've grown up with them or how you haven't, right? I grew up with all this local news because we didn't have cable TV, and but now I'm kind of into the local news, so maybe that's an age factor, or maybe it's sometimes I like it. Well, the stuff I like is really just the weather, and we've already just done an episode about the weather, and just what's going on in the area, because it might be something that my family and I want to go do. There's the Army Navy boat race going on, or stuff like that, because the news that I get tends to be out of Philadelphia, even though I'm essentially an hour away from Philly and an hour away from New York. So that's why I watch it now, but other than that, I don't. And there's some other fun, kind of human interest, other local news. There is a lot about this shooting or that shooting or and that kind of stuff. It is sad. I just can't watch it continuously. So, from that standpoint, I don't love the news. I should say I like the news. I just don't. If it's going on and on about this crime or that crime, I know what's happening, but I can't hear it all the time. It's just not good for my health, and maybe that's not a good thing, but I know it's happening and it's sad, and I recognize how sad it is, but I need to tune into something else. It's funny. when I moved to California, I moved without A because he was still tied down at a job back here in New Jersey. And so I moved into 2 different houses. Well, in the second house, sweet little town right next door to Palo Alto. No crime, nothing really serious. But I started getting into reading the local newspaper. Well, I was living on my own, and I'll be honest, I'm a scaredy cat. I am. So I would be reading, like, the police blotter, and it's, like, not that exciting, right? But I'm somewhat naive. I've never lived on my own. It's the first time I started reading the local newspaper. And, like, I remember specifically one time that there was, like, this report about people that were entering people's homes, like, they leave their door unlocked, or even if they did leave their door unlocked. But I can't remember the exact story, but I think people, like, basically did, like, leave a lot of unlocked doors, and, like, there were thieves that went in and stole while the people were sleeping. And I was like, oh my God, right? And so, you know, like, after that, I was like, okay, I can't read this news because it's going to freak me out. And also, I was very OCD about, like, making sure every door was locked, like, a couple of times. I would look under every bed. I would look in every closet. Like, I've always been kind of a nervous, like, person when it comes to staying home on my own, which is why I completely empathize with my youngest, Jay, who's the same way. She does not like to be home by herself, especially in the dark. So I get that. Because I was the same way. Because A was halfway across the country, so I'd come home from work, I'd look under the bed, I'd look in all the closets to make sure there wasn't a quote-unquote monster. Like, seriously, I'm like 32 years old, right? So what am I doing? Reading the local police blotter. I don't know how I got into the paper. I think it was just like learn about the area and stuff like that, but I gave up on that. I mean, now where we live, I do sometimes read it, but it's kind of just crap. I mean, I don't want to say it's crap. It's not really. That's not fair. But it's just like politics and I don't know. It's like this view or that view, and I can't get so caught up in that local news. Sometimes there's an interesting story that I want to read or learn more about, but generally, I mean, I kind of know, like, that the piece is, like, motivated, like, biased a certain way, and so it's just kind of lost on me. But I will leave you with this one point. The one thing I like that's fun, right, is, like, when I fly, which is not as often right now these days, but it used to be, I would get, like, just, like, fun magazines, like People magazine, and maybe you won't define that as news, but for me, it was just, like, fun news, and I would just, like, read about some celebrity here or there, and, like, it was just, you know, as much as I don't like the tabloids in terms of, like, what the reporters do to people, I just enjoyed the more simple aspect of it. You know, maybe, like, I don't know, maybe a better example is, like, Real Simple, like that magazine. It just has, like, interesting human stories in it, and I consider that, like, a source of news. So, you know, I love magazines still. I don't buy as many anymore, but I do like the physicality of holding a newspaper or holding a magazine and the information in it. So I'd be curious, Muffy, what you think about, like, what is considered news? Like, what is your opinion on the news? How do you find it noteworthy, or how do you include it in your life, and what does it really mean to you?
Hey Habs, it's Muffy. Oh, the news. What a hot topic. Just calling the name the news. It's just so hot right now. Uh, I don't know. For me, chronicling the news in my life, my parents growing up always had local news on wherever we were. And then of some evening news, I think they were with the CBS evening news mainly. I remember Walter Cronkite even. They'd be watching him. And, I was not that interested at all, of course, but I'm very familiar with the CBS evening news music. So I knew that they were watching it. Also, they loved 60 Minutes. Sunday nights, they would have 60 Minutes on the ticking clock, and I kind of got used to those different reporters doing different intriguing stories. I have to say my parents were never big morning news people. They never had those shows on that I remember at all, actually, which is kind of interesting to think about. We didn't really have, maybe there wasn't as much of that on back in those days, but there wasn't the morning programs weren't as hot as they were back then. But yes, news was definitely in my household. And my parents always got the local city paper, like the Cleveland Plain Dealer or wherever we were, the small town paper, whatever it was. They got it delivered every day and read it. And my father in particular would read it, probably 4 or 5 times in a given day. So they really enjoyed their newspaper. And I think I was joking with you recently about me cutting out articles from the paper and sending it to you in the mail the old-fashioned way, right? People would look up an article and then they would, think of somebody and clip it out and send it in the mail. Because sometimes when I send a link, if the person isn't subscribed to something like the New York Times, they're not going to open it up. So I, like my parents, subscribe to the paper, but only get it on Sundays. But the Sunday is the one that's like chock full of interesting articles, and at least in my opinion, that I want to read like that. So I often find myself, as you said, it's kind of an old folks thing. Like that, I'm that old person clipping out articles from the paper. Yes, I do get the New York Times on Sundays, but I think I get it today mainly for like the arts and leisure section, real estate section, the book section, the metropolitan section, opinion section. I like to read all of those different areas, of what's going on in the city, across all these different spheres. So that's always like fun for me. That's why I like to get the Sunday Times. Otherwise, these days, I have to say, I really, as far as TV news, I don't really watch it any longer. I, like you, get pretty, I think it can be hard on one's mental health to be listening to the news today with all, like you said, the shootings getting reported and a lot of violent crime. It's sort of like, oh my gosh, is it really safe to go on the subway? Or, should I walk down that block? It's easy to kind of get paranoid and think that that's going to be you. So I haven't been watching the local news except for sometimes the weather report. When we had the Arctic blast last week, I was like, okay, how low are these temperatures going to be? And how long is this going to go for? I'm still really curious about that, but I have sort of not tuned into local news on the TV. Then I always used to watch, if I was home, the national news. I was like my parents, CBS. Sometimes I like the David Muir on ABC, and I like him because he's our generation. I don't know. I just feel like he's like very like modern now. But sometimes I think ABC News at night is sort of a little bit too like Frosted Flake, sugarcoaty. Whereas I feel like I get a little bit more substance with CBS. And I was actually kind of sad last week because Norah O'Donnell was the anchor for the CBS Evening News, and she is gone. She has left, I think, as of last Thursday, and I just happened to have the evening news on. And then all of a sudden there's a tribute from Oprah Winfrey to her with all her accolades about how she anchored the news. And I was, oh my goodness, that's an end of an era. I usually don't watch to the end of the news like that, the evening news, but that day I happened to. But I usually just watch the first 10 minutes and then I'm sort of on to something else, or, it might be on in the background, but I'm not really paying attention. So very, very limited on TV news these days. It used to be, I used to watch CBS mornings with that crew, Gail and I think Nate, some other people. I used to watch that, and I used to watch for the fun stuff. What was it? Kelly and Mark, I think. Yeah, Live with Kelly and Mark, just like fun. I loved how I like the first 15 minutes where they banter back and forth about whatever's going on in their lives or different headlines I think that's kind of like akin to your Today Show. I thought that was always kind of fun. But I don't really watch any of it anymore. I think for my mental health these days, I listen to classical music. It's 2025 and Muffy's got the classical music on, and that's what I've got going. And I take heart in all these classical composers and their brilliance and their minds. And that's sort of where I am. In news, like I still get the Sunday New York Times and I read through it. Then that gives me the subscription to the online New York Times. And I'm just really careful about designating maybe 10 minutes each day to looking at the headlines, seeing what's going on, and then kind of putting it aside. I'm getting more and more interested in curating a news feed that is really quite sensitive. If I'm really going to give my attention to news, then I want it to be fact-informed, substantive, and not hysterical, not inflammatory, not, backbiting. I just want good news. So I have actually, this is so new for me, but I'm on Blue Sky now, like some sort of social media app. It looks like Twitter, but I think it is actually a different type of platform. And I'm curating my own news feed by certain reporters that I trust, certain sources that I think are worthy, to actually give my attention to there. So it's been a real different relationship to the news recently, where I really am very limited on the New York Times and just going to this Blue Sky feed that I'm building. And that's just totally different. Totally different. I used to also get news off of a lot of social channels like Facebook. And I have recently left Facebook, like just left it cold turkey. And I don't know. I don't think I miss actually the news that I was getting there. Like, people would repost different things they saw. I can't say I was ever opening that, but you'd see the headline, right? And so it sort of inform you of something. But I kind of feel like that was sort of the choir chirping at me, and I don't really need that choir anymore. So I'm just very much kind of taking over agency over what I'm going to be letting in. And I'm very, very, very discerning. And I haven't always been that way. Like I said, I would have the TV on the background, CBS mornings, then Kelly and Mark, then the evening news, then all these different, papers and Facebook and whatever's coming at me. And I'm just not that way anymore. And I don't know if that's just also me becoming older and more discerning or what. But yeah, I think it is actually better for my mental health. And you were right to point out, like those shootings, we know excuse me, I have a frog in my throat. We know that those things are going on. I mean, people are maybe like, well, that's and I really do hate the word privilege. That's your privilege that you can turn it off. It's really never turned off in our society anymore. I mean, it's just always on. We all know it's like happening, mass violence all the time at every level. I don't think there's anybody who has privilege to hide away from that. So I just choose not to know the details of it. I thought was really interesting about the neighbor's blotter, the police blotter you were listening to. We had one of those in Seattle, our neighborhood. And I lived in a very, very rough neighborhood, a very interurban, lots of stuff happening. And people in my neighborhood would be like, oh, did you see this thing happened on the neighbor's blotter? I forget the name of that one that was in Seattle. I forget that platform. And I was like, no. Oh, aren't you on it? You'll find out everything, all these break-ins and all. It was happening left, right, and center. So many different things with all the issues in Seattle with public safety in the neighborhoods. And I was like, absolutely not. Because like, if I let that in, I will be completely, completely paranoid. Because there's something happening every minute, probably like right next door to me all the time. So I never, ever let any of that in. And I think in some ways, not having as much news in one's life is blissful. I mean, ignorance is bliss. These people were like, this just happened. This one, I'm like, okay, but I'm not reading it. I'm not following it. So it was sort of like, is it happening if you're not following it? Kind of interesting question. So yeah, I didn't really take up the police blotter, the neighbor's blotter. I was actually into the local Seattle news when I lived there. Well, we had Cairo 7, I think, which was the CBS affiliate out there. And I loved watching it. I loved that news crew. And, I watched them for 17 years. So I think we do get kind of attached to our local newscasters. It's always fun to kind of see local news. I don't know these days what's happened to me, but I'm just not into the news. It's not where I want my mind to be first thing when I'm waking up. Yeah. And the one I wish I could get, which I cannot get, which that I love, especially when I travel, is CNN International. It is so very, very, very different from the CNN we get in America. It's very hard to access from America for some reason. I think you have to go to the CNN website and then log into it via your internet provider, and then you can get CNN International. But I've not really been able to access CNN International, truth be told. I just haven't been able to. So people are saying another one that's good that's international is BBC, which is fine. I also like BBC. When we lived in Canada, BBC was where we really got a lot of our news. It was like part and parcel of the Canadian news system. And I love the music and the countdown to their news. It's just I love their weather report. It's always got an international thought on it. And the music, it's digitized music. I love it. So, maybe that's a news source I'll put on more and more on my computer just to hear international news. People sometimes say, what was I thinking about there? I think I lost I think people sometimes think about Al Jazeera. I was over in Amsterdam and that happened to be on, and it doesn't resonate as much with me, but it is a different point of view. And I guess sometimes for me, the news is about the different point of view. I don't really like being in an echo chamber. I don't like to be in any sort of chamber, actually. Maybe that's why I turn to chamber music these days. I don't want to be pigeonholed with news and be thinking a certain way because someone said something that I don't even know is right or wrong, or true or not. It's all very confusing these days. So for me, it's a lot about just limiting news more and more. And when I put my attention toward it, limiting that time, but whatever time I am giving to it, just being very discreet about it and discerning about it. And I too like a good magazine, Habs. I like to cut them up for different little boards I do and stuff, like different ideas, like different words resonate with me. So I like to our images. So I like to go through magazines and clip those out, but I always read them first. I always think it's fun. Like you said, like a little bit of celebrity news or something going on in the makeup world, or I don't know. It's just fun to kind of read a magazine. It's so kind of old fashioned these days. And the one I always used to like was Real Simple, as you mentioned. I always thought that was such a great magazine. I don't get it anymore, but I used to subscribe. But yeah, I like a good magazine. That's also news. It's fun to think about news sources and our history with the news and where we are today at this age with relating and listening and taking in the news as almost like the weather. Everyone's talking about the weather. I guess people are always talking about the news too. Maybe less so today because everyone's got different ideas about the news, but it's still like everybody's got some angle on the news. I just want to say I feel like a radical because basically my news is classical music. As I've been saying recently, everything old is new again.
Oh my, Muffy, you bring back memories. I do remember Walter Cronkite. He actually had a home on the vineyard, and we also had a home on the vineyard. And my parents would always point out his house, and he was always in the local news. So yeah, that totally brought back some memories. Also, the concept of the Sunday newspapers. I forgot about it, but growing up, my parents always got the newspapers on Sunday. I don't know if we got them throughout the week, but definitely on Sunday after we got back from church, my parents would scour the newspapers. My mom would clip coupons and I would read the Sunday funnies, like the cartoon. I loved reading the cartoons, and I liked also just, all the ads and things for various items. It was fun to kind of do some shopping in the newspaper. So that really brought back memories. Yes, I remember 60 Minutes. My uncle loved 60 Minutes. I never got into it, but I always think of him when I think of 60 Minutes. So it's a kind of a nice association. My uncle hit his head and had a head concussion for most of his adult life after slamming into a tree and got in a car accident and hit his head. He was driving away from a fight with his wife, it's very sad, but also, not to digress here, a lesson, like don't drive away in your car if you've had a fight with a loved one, or anyone for that matter. I'm not laughing, it's not funny, but he definitely had some special needs after that, and he lived with my grandfather, but yeah, he was a special person. I also forgot to mention that I really like NPR. I listen to NPR sometimes in my car, through Sirius Radio. I do listen to BBC. I do like it. I like it because it reports on news that's not being reported in the U.S. because we're so U.S.-centric that a lot of times, if we do get news from elsewhere in the world, it's very limited and specific, whereas like you get a lot more of the news just going on around the world from BBC. I am going to have to check out CNN International because, yeah, I do find when I travel, I love the news stations that I have when I'm not in the U.S. So just offer very different perspectives, just more well-rounded and less slanted, less biased, but just more interesting overall. And they tend to cover such a wide range of topics. Yes, I know you do like to cut out newspaper articles. We send them to people or give them to people. My mother-in-law does that as well. And I enjoy it because it's nice just to sometimes get a piece of paper. I mean, I don't do a lot of online news. I might do research, but when it comes to reading, I like a physical product. I love the feeling of a newspaper. I love the feeling of a book. And you don't get that feeling, when you do something online. But, it also brings back memories of when I was younger, people would send articles to my mom and dad if we were like in the local newspaper. Like one time I was in the local newspaper and my second grade teacher, Ms. Benigno, who I loved, I don't think she's no longer with us, but she would send pictures of me. Like I was in the Girl Scouts one time and something else. I don't know. But Miss Benigno sent that newspaper and just commented on whatever it was that the article was talking about and the fact that I was in it. And sometimes people would just send articles and not even make any comments. It's just nobody really does that nowadays, for sure. I love that, instead of, opting out of the news, you're listening to your classical music. And it just, again, I'm kind of digressing here, but I am curious. Do you listen to like pop songs or do you mostly listen to classical music? It was a question that popped up. I hear it often in the background when you send me voice memos, like personal voice memos. And then you were just commenting on the fact that instead of the news, you're just listening to your classical music, especially the chamber music. And I was like, I wonder if she listens to pop music or any other kind of music. I was just curious about that. You mentioned also the local news, the local newspapers. Yeah, Princeton has local newspapers. I think they're quite jaded. I think they're kind of masterminded by a few who have money. And so I don't really read a lot of the local news. In fact, I have noticed as of more recently, not in the past year, but like the past 5 or 6 years, that it doesn't really cover some of the very important news. For example, I don't ever see and there are some online news sources as well that I do sometimes look at briefly, but I never find that interesting or eye-opening. But I find there's actual crime in Princeton, which sounds ridiculous, but there is. I mean, it's most likely white-collar crime, to be honest. But, Lululemon got, they had a bunch of teenagers rob them of all this apparel And then more recently, another new clothing store, I forget the name of it, it's new, but a bunch of people just went in and took all this product off the shelves and the display tables. And I had a neighborhood acquaintance who was there and, didn't do anything, but almost. And the police were like, no, don't ever do anything. Just, let the police take care of it. But yeah. And then our favorite grocery store, it has some crime in their beer and wine area. And so it's shocking, but I don't see that in the news. We also had an ICE raid in town, which I just recently heard about. And it was kind of like under the radar. So it's not stuff that's being reported. Yeah, I mean, it's very interesting, right? The news, what's reported, what's not, locally, nationally, across the globe. I mean, you're right. In some cases, there are things we just don't need to know, and ignorance is bliss. I always say, the government doesn't need to tell us everything. Now, I mean, that could be a debatable subject right now, but there are some things that are best left uncovered. I'll just say that. Not everything, but some things. And then again, some things that maybe do need to be uncovered, like the ICE raids in P-Town. You were talking about local newscasters, and I was reminded of a weatherman in D.C. back in the 90s when we were living there. And I loved him. I mean, I was in my 20s, so I can say this because I said it then, but he was adorable. And yes, I know I can say that because at the time I thought he was adorable. I forget what his name is. He kind of looked like Dule Hill. I'm sure I'm not pronouncing his name correctly, but that American actor, he was in The West Wing and some other things. But yeah, I still have fond memories of watching him every morning. So you reminded me about that. So it is interesting to reflect on in the news and what the news means. Especially like you were mentioning, everything old is new again. And it kind of made me start to wonder, or think about, where are we today with the news? Has it changed or has it really not changed? It's just an interesting question because history repeats itself, right? And have we really evolved in the news? Or is it very much like it was when we were growing up in the days of our parents? I think that's hard for you and I to assess because our perceptions when we were younger are so different than they are today. But I kind of wonder, I kind of think they haven't really changed. When you look at everything, how much have we really evolved other than the mechanics of the news? I don't know. I'd be curious to know what you think about that, Muffy.
Hey, Habs, it's Muffy. Good question. Has the news changed from when we were kids to now? The thing that strikes me most of all is the 24 hours news cycle. As a kid, I remember the evening news, and that was a big moment. People had gone to work, people had gone to school. They lived their life in their community, in their immediate surroundings, taking care of the news of their own day, whatever was happening at work or school, or, for stay-at-home moms, if they were staying at home, whatever was going on in their days. And then at night, there'd be a half an hour of local news. What happened beyond my world in my community today? And then there'd be a half an hour of national news. And that was your oh, okay, that's what took place today, wherever in the world that they were covering or at the national level. And that was, and then you moved on to your evening programming, maybe the game shows like Jeopardy. I don't know if that was on back then, but that kind of hour, and then just into your prime time and you went to bed and that was it. And I guess you'd get up and there were the morning shows, but I don't think they were quite as on as they are now. And then you just waited again for your evening news and your local news. There wasn't the CNNs and the Foxes and the MSNBCs and just the round-the-clock news cycle, which I don't know if it's a good thing or a bad thing to have the round-the-clock 24-hour every minute. It's not even 24-hour. It's minute-to-minute news, breaking right now. I think that's where we get kind of inundated and just barraged. No matter what your news source is, it's on every second of the day. and we can access it. And then we can access it across, these news channels, but also all the social channels, depending on who you're following, what you're doing. It's just always there. Then the news itself, the newspapers are online, updating their headlines throughout the whole day. Used to be you'd have the newspaper come to you in the morning, get delivered, and like that was your news for the day, in the newspaper. And you had to wait for the next printing to get the next cycle of news in the newspaper. And there just seems to be something really lost in being able to have news on every minute. I mean, it's big money, it's big business, it's cultivated and curated for certain audiences, but it's just always on. And I think that's the biggest difference I've noticed between being a kid and being an adult in 2025 is just, it's never ending. It's just always there. Yeah, as soon as you said about the Sunday paper, I immediately thought about clipping coupons. I remember my mother clipping coupons and thinking, oh, whatever coupons she didn't clip out, I'm going to clip the rest of them. I just like clipping things out. And she gets so annoyed because she didn't buy that stuff. I was like, look what they're sending out for you. I love that. And I did love the Sunday funnies. I used to always read those with my grandfather when we were visit them. He loved the Sunday funnies. They were in color and they were just so fun. And we would read them together. And I just love those memories. So thank you for bringing that back to me, Habs, because those were two of my most favorite sections for sure. I'm also like you. I love the feeling of, holding a book, holding a newspaper, holding a magazine, and actually reading. Maybe that's just our old schoolness about us, but I also like that. When I travel, I always have the Kindle and my books just because it just makes more sense given weight of things when we travel. But I definitely prefer to have a real book in my hand and a real magazine. You were mentioning magazines earlier. And I think that, that's the very best. That nothing compares in my opinion, but that's probably just being an old fogey. I also thought about, it was interesting when you talked about being in the newspaper, your local newspaper, and I immediately brought to mind my younger brother, M, who made the front page of our Central Pennsylvania local newspaper back when we lived there for a brief stint in the 80s. And he was a great fan of skateboarding. And for some reason, they put his picture on the front of the paper, him skateboarding with this funny look on his face. And my parents bought like 15 copies and handed it out to everybody they knew. I thought that was so funny about that. But yeah, when your kid got in the paper, that's like a big deal. So yeah, that just brought back that memory immediately. I can see right now so vividly his picture on the front page of that local little paper. And, for us as kids, that was our paper, right? It was a small town little paper, but it was like the big leagues for us to be in any sort of paper. So it was like a big news. I think it's interesting about asking about classical music and do I listen to pop music? Yes, I mean, pretty much I am stuck in the 80s. And when I'm in my car, I always have the 80s music on, or I have yacht rock radio on, listening to the 70s music, or the channel, The Blend, which has like soft music from the 70s and 80s and probably 90s maybe. I also listen to First Wave, which was the first wave of the, kind of the UK bands that came over in the early 80s. I love that channel. Don't much care for the 90s channel because I'm not a huge fan of 90s music, except maybe the music from the 90s when we were in college. Once we went to DC, like I hated the music of the 90s. And it's kind of interesting because I lived in Seattle where the grunge, whole movement came from in the neighborhood I lived in for 17 years. Like that's where like the home of Nirvana and all of that, which like ruled the 90s, was like the era I could not stand in like regular pop music. And that's where it was born. That was my neighborhood of 17 years. So I think that's just kind of interesting. But yeah, I do. I listen to a lot more than just pop than classical music. But for some reason, classical music in the mornings when I'm getting ready or just doing kind of my own morning routine throughout the day. When I'm working, I just can hear something in the background. I really like classical music. And I just think I think there's like studies that have shown like if you listen to classical music, like on the regular, your mind kind of attunes to a higher frequency. I don't know what that's about, but like it allows for more, I don't know, critical thinking, higher level of thinking skills. I think for me, it gives me more outlets of my creativity. It just opens up space. I think classical music just opens up space for self to dwell in ways that music with lyrics, more modern music doesn't. So I tend to move toward classical music, especially in the mornings or in my home. But like when I'm in the car and stuff, no, I'm listening to lots of other different kinds of things. So I think that's kind of an interesting question. And I think it just leads me into the idea of being really careful with what our news sources are, how much news we're taking in. I work with patients every day thinking about the news, people's news feeds, and like the doom scrolling, or are they happy scrolling, right? And like just news, like a lot of people are into the news of like TV shows and like where is an episode going and like delving into the news of that show. So it doesn't always have to be about the news of, political news or something. It can be like entertainment news or show news or people news. But just kind of like being informed about what news you're into and tracking and where is your mind, because what we let into our worlds as far as the news is sort of kind of where the mind tracks to, right? And one of the things I've noticed is just people so into other people's news, right? There's all this content up that people are talking about, and people are just scrolling, watching the news of other people's days, right? Instead of like creating the news of one's own day. I think that's the greatest hazard we're living in right now. Like I said, back in the day when we were kids, you went off and lived in your life and dwelled in your life, adults and kids alike. And then you came and saw some limited version of what was going on out there. Now you never have to live your own life or dwell in your own life. You can and create your own life. You can just live and dwell in the creativity and the creation of others' lives. And I think that is super dangerous. And I hope that everybody engages in the news, but also, most importantly, engages in creating the news of their own life.
I really like your answer to my question about what may have changed in the news back from when we were younger to today in 2025. And I agree, it's the around-the-clock news. I think it makes us more oblivious, more immune, because we always have it available. It's almost like it becomes white noise. So it's not as surprising as like back in the day when, the news was at night and the news was in the morning. And like you said, during the day, everybody just went on living their own lives and writing their own stories. I love your response about listening to classical music and it opening space. I completely agree with that. I'm going to have to start listening a little bit more. I love the 80s. I love the 70s. I don't mind the 90s. I like grunge as well, or alternative music. So I just really appreciate your answer. I'm just going to leave this final thought. We were talking about newspaper clippings and your brother M and getting in the newspaper back when you lived in Pennsylvania. And it just reminded me that I also got in the newspaper when we were at school at Wittenberg in Springfield. It was a nice day and somebody must have been taking a picture of me running and just reporting that I got into the Springfield news, which is kind of funny if you think about it. Anyways, I will leave you with that final thought on the subject of the news.
Thanks for listening to Habs and Muffy discuss what's in the news this week. For more, please follow us at Girls Who Gab with Habs and Muffy on Instagram. Till next time.